and I support it.
David Clark.
Mr Speaker, I rise to take a call in support of this bill, and I hope I certainly can meet and possibly exceed the high standard of debate just forwarded by Mr Hayes in his short, succinct and worthy contribution. I enjoyed the irony in his comments on politicising. You know, usually those who like to throw stones in that glass house know how they're thrown. And indeed, Todd McClay, in his earlier contribution, rued that politics had entered the debate after a select committee that had worked so well and collaboratively. And I certainly always admire Mr McClay's ability to insist on the absence of politics in debate when the politics doesn't suit him. He is nothing if not consistent, Mr Speaker. The debate, of course, in the select committee was a good one. We heard many submissions from many organisations that had important things to say, that had experiences to share, and that indeed had much research behind their submissions. And we discussed topics such as the unintended consequences of this rise in the excise, the 10% increases year by year from the 1st of January in 2013, 2014, 2015, 2016. And we wondered what might happen. Overseas evidence was considered, and a view was presented that homegrown tobacco would be more popular as a consequence. I'm assured by those who know more about this than I that flavour won't be leading that move, but the quality of homegrown tobacco apparently is not perhaps what can be purchased in the shops, but that indeed some people will endeavour to produce their own as they struggle to meet the costs of rising tobacco prices. We also discussed the introduction of duty-free, of amendments to the duty-free treatment of tobacco, and it's regrettable that the government hasn't done something to tackle that. It appears that they could be open to accusations of having one rule for those who can't afford international travel and a different rule for those who can. And we can see their priorities indeed in getting this through. They are not entirely comfortable with the legislation, one suspects, although it will raise an additional $528 million over the next 4 years. And one suspects that it's perhaps along the lines of the other tax grabs we saw in the budget, a bit of a cynical measure aimed at those whom they have done the least to support during their time in this government, Mr Speaker. The increases will be made in combination with CPI indexation of the duties that occur annually on the 1st of January, and we know this will have a significant effect on the final cost. The Treasury, in its analysis of in the regulatory impact statement that it's presented to the House, has said that tobacco consumption imposes significant costs on government. We know that to be the case, but it also makes the point that these costs, these negative externalities, are largely met by the existing excise, and so further increases in tobacco excise cannot be justified on the grounds of meeting all the health costs that arise from the smoking of tobacco. In the Treasury's words, smokers are probably already paying their way in narrow fiscal terms. But that's where the Treasury analysis stops. And it's disappointing because then the Treasury go on to say that it may also reduce labour productivity, and it may have other impacts that are internalised, they speculate, through effective wage rates and the functioning of the labour market. But they haven't taken the time, or they don't have the time, they say, to research those impacts fully. And this is a pattern we're seeing out of the public service at the moment as various parts of it are squashed, and where morale is low from a government that is choosing to bring in consultants rather than to value the contributions of public service policy analysts. And we saw a similar pattern with my bill to Mundai's, Anzac and Waitangi. The effect of on productivity of policy changes is not being assessed because it is hard work, and those policy analysts who have it on their agenda simply cannot afford the time or are not encouraged to do it by the current government. And that must be disappointing as we seek to have the best possible advice when making these decisions that affect a significant portion of our population. We're told that 1 in 5 New Zealanders is a smoker today, so 20% of our population is adult population is affected by this legislation entirely and directly. Smoking remains the single biggest cause of preventable morbidity and mortality in New Zealand. So there's no doubt we need to tackle this, and that is why Labour will support it. Labour indeed took measures under extraordinary urgency to increase the excise on tobacco back in the early 2000s. And we see here a move by this government to increase it in a series of steps, but all put through in one swift move. And I guess it's probably a little distasteful to them if we turn our minds back to the comments of Bill English in 2000, and he had this to say. He said the reason we voted against this measure, as the government then did, was that the government did not ever say that it would do it, and that it is the measure it set, not us. The government did not say before the election that it would do it. That is the government's standard, not ours. It is a tax increase. It is a tax on the poorest people in New Zealand. It is an increase that is far too large, and that is why we voted against it. Well, how times have changed, Mr. Speaker. We have a government that is suffering from a low tax take. We've seen a 4% drop since the global financial crisis in revenues. The tax department says that 1.5% of that can be attributed to the global financial crisis, roughly in line with what other countries have expected and experienced. But that 2.5% of that drop in revenue can be attributed directly to government policy changes. And here we're talking about measures that the government described as broadly fiscally neutral. We're going back to those 2010 tax cuts where we know that 44% of the value of those tax cuts went to the top 10% of earners, and just 2% of the value of those 2010 tax cuts went to the bottom 20% of earners. And those are the people, I suggest, Mr. Speaker, who are disproportionately again affected by this excise tax. It's a government that says one thing and then does another. It votes against this kind of legislation in one term under one government and then brings it through in its own government when, really by expediency, it's faced with a revenue hole that needs to be filled. So this government has put up this tax and done it in a way that hasn't really been signalled. It's done it to paper over the big hole, Mr. Speaker, in the books that is created by that tax so-called switch. The majority of the benefits we know for the lower income earners, in fact all of them were swallowed up very quickly in GST. And then beyond that, with rising living costs, we know that the median wage recently dropped by 3%. This is a government that is overseeing the worst economic record of any government in 50 years. I'm sure Mr. Bennett will rise soon to dispute these facts or to defend the approach they're taking or to tell us that it's a long-term strategy, that it's broadly fiscally neutral if you interpret broadly in the sense of, over the next 100 years, or some other excuse. What we're seeing here is a government that has lost the revenue that it was expecting, that's grabbing for some more revenue. Ultimately, we do support measures that will stop people smoking over time, that discourage smoking. They're the same kinds of measures that would be interesting to see employed in the alcohol space. We know alcohol-related harm could be reduced by pulling the big levers of marketing and price. These are the recommendations of the Law Commission. Again, the government has said it won't go near them this time. I guess we wait for another 10 years to see if it will back out of that view as well and come round and come to terms with the fact that there are ways to change behaviour. This measure is a measure that the government is taking. We will support it because we believe that it is important to address this single biggest cause of morbidity and mortality in New Zealand. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker.
I call David Bennett.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the Labor Party just needed to say that last